Something happened in April that the headlines got exactly half right. They told you wages are up. They told you the economy is growing. They told you inflation is cooling down. And every single one of those things is technically true. So why does it feel like you have less money than you did a year ago? Because you do. Not because you're bad with money. Not because you didn't get a raise. Because there is a gap, invisible, mathematically precise, and almost never explained, between the number on your paycheck and the number that actually matters. Today, we're going to close that gap. My name isn't important. What I did for 30 years, that might be. I spent 3 decades inside the kind of institutions that produce these numbers, analyzing them, presenting them to people who made very large decisions based on them. And the one thing I noticed consistently over 30 years is that the people making those decisions almost never had to live inside them. I'm retired now, and I started this channel because I think that needs to change. Now, before we go any further, I want to be straightforward with you about something. Everything I share on this channel is education, it's analysis. It is not financial advice, and it is not a substitute for a professional who actually knows your specific situation. I've spent 30 years watching people make expensive mistakes because they acted on general information as if it were personal guidance. Don't be that person. If you're making significant money decisions, talk to someone who knows your numbers. All right, with that said, let's get into it. The April 2026 inflation report dropped on May 12th, and buried inside 60 pages of government data was a single finding that should have been the lead story on every financial news channel in America. Real wages just went negative. That means the average American worker, after accounting for inflation, is earning less today than they were a year ago. Not because wages fell, because prices ran faster. Now, I know what you're thinking. We've heard this before. Inflation, wages, blah, blah, blah. And you're right, we have been here before, several times. And each time the story gets told the same way. Big numbers, scary headlines, and then nothing particularly useful for the person sitting at the kitchen table trying to figure out next month's budget. That's not what we're doing today. Today we're going to do 3 things. First, we're going to look at exactly what the April numbers show and why the headline CPI figure is only telling you half the story. Second, we're going to put this moment in historical context because I have lived through enough of these cycles to know that perspective is the most underrated financial tool there is. And third, we're going to talk about what you can actually do. Specific, practical, zero speculation moves for this week and this month. Let's start with the number nobody's talking about. Let me show you something. Imagine you earned $50,000 last April. And this April, after a year of solid work, decent performance review, maybe a little negotiating, your employer gave you a 4% raise. That's a good raise, above average actually. Your new salary, $52,000. Now let's do the math that your HR department didn't do for you. The same basket of goods and services that cost $50 in April 2025 costs $51,900 in April 2026. That's what 3.8% inflation does to your purchasing power over 12 months. Your raise, $2,000. Inflation's take, $1,900. What you actually kept, $100. $100 for a year of work, for a year of everything going up. And that's the optimistic version, the one where you got a 4% raise. The median raise this year was closer to 3%. Run those numbers, and you're not breaking even. You're behind. Now, a lot of people stop the analysis right there. Inflation beat wages, sad story, moving on. But I want to show you why, because understanding the why is the only way to defend against it. Look at where April's inflation actually came from. The BLS report is very specific about this. Energy, just energy, of April's entire monthly price increase. Not food, not rent, not healthcare, energy, 40%. Let me put some faces on that number. Gasoline, up 28.4% year over year. Fuel oil, what a lot of American homes still use for heat, up 54.3%. The national average at the pump on May 12th, the day this report dropped, $4.50 per gallon, a 43.6% jump from a year ago. I spent 30 years in rooms full of economists, and I can tell you, There is nothing quite like watching a PhD explain why gasoline prices are transitory to a room full of people who drive 40 miles to work each way. The word transitory does not fit well in a pickup truck. This energy shock has a proximate cause. Financial press has widely attributed it to the oil supply disruption following the Iran conflict that began in late February, specifically the disruptions near the Strait of Hormuz. I want to be clear, that is context, not a political statement. The economics don't care who's responsible. Your gas tank doesn't either. Here's what matters. Roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes through that strait. When that flow gets disrupted, even partially, even temporarily, the price signal hits American pump prices within weeks. We saw this in 2022. We're seeing a version of it again now. But here's the part of this story that genuinely bothers me. This inflation is not hitting everyone equally. The BLS data is unambiguous on this. Lower-income households, the bottom quintile, spend somewhere between 25 and 35% of their after-tax income on food. The highest earners, 7 to 10%. When gasoline jumps 28%, a household spending 3% of their income on gas feels a pinch. A household spending 12% of their income on gas, they feel it in their mortgage payment. Blue-collar commuters, retirees on fixed incomes, lower middle-class families in suburban and rural areas where driving isn't optional. These are the people absorbing the sharpest end of April's numbers. And they're the people least likely to have the financial cushion to absorb it quietly. I want to give you one more number before we move on, because I think it's the one that puts all of this in the sharpest perspective. That $200 weekly grocery run you were doing in January of 2020, the same items, same brands, same quantities, same list, cost you $257 today. That's $57 a week, nearly $3,000 a year. Not on anything new, not on anything better, on the exact same groceries. Now, I've been in this business long enough to know that when the data looks this grim, the instinct is to either panic or to tune out entirely. I want to suggest a third option, understanding what has happened before, because this is not the first time American workers have found themselves running hard just to stay in place. And the history of those moments, what worked, what didn't, and what the people who came through them actually did. That's worth a few minutes of your time. If this kind of breakdown is helping you make sense of what's actually happening to your household budget, subscribing means you won't miss the next analysis. And I promise you, the next topic is going to matter just as much as this one. But right now, let's go back, way back. October 1974. I was 19 years old, sitting in an economics class at a state university I could barely afford, watching my professor walk and holding something I had never seen before. A red button, about the size of a $50, and printed on it, in white block letters, WIN, whip inflation now. That was President Ford's plan. October 8th, 1974, joint session of Congress. He declared inflation public enemy #1 and launched a voluntary citizens campaign. 15 million buttons, pledge cards, victory gardens, carpooling. Americans were asked to spend less, waste less, and essentially willpower their way out of 12% inflation. My professor put that button on his desk and said, and I'm paraphrasing here, "Gentlemen, this is what happens when the people in charge understand the problem but have no idea how to solve it." Inflation in 1974 was running at 12.3%. The WIN campaign ran for about 5 months before quietly disappearing. Prices kept climbing. Alan Greenspan, Ford's own chief economic advisor at the time, later called the whole thing unbelievable stupidity. Inflation didn't break until 1983, 9 years after those buttons. Now, I'm not telling you this to be glib about what the government did or didn't do. I'm telling you this because there is a pattern in how these inflation episodes get communicated to the public. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The pattern is this: reassurance first, reality second. It's transitory, it's cooling, the fundamentals are strong, and then the grocery receipt tells a different story. Fast forward 3 years to the Carter administration, 1977 to 1981. This is the one economic period in modern American history that I think about more than any other because it is the most complete case study we have of what sustained inflation actually does to a working family over time. By 1980, the inflation rate hit 13.5%. Mortgage rates touched 18%. 18%. If you wanted to buy a house in 1980, you were paying nearly a fifth of your loan value, every single year, just in interest. Over Carter's full term, the cumulative price level rose 48.6%. Real wages adjusted for inflation, fell 6% in his first 3 years. Workers were getting raises, good raises in some years, and they were getting poorer anyway. When I was working at the agency in those early years, this would have been around 1980, 1981. I remember a senior colleague of mine, 20 years my senior, man who had seen the Depression as a child, sitting across from me in a conference room. And he looked at the data we were running and he said, "The cruelest thing inflation does is make hard work feel pointless." I've never forgotten that, because that is exactly what the April 2026 numbers are starting to whisper. Not shout, whisper. And I think it's worth hearing it clearly before it gets louder. Now, here's what I want you to hold on to, because the history isn't all grim. What eventually worked, what actually broke the back of 1970s inflation, was not buttons. It was not pledge cards. It was Paul Volcker appointed Fed chair in 1979, raising the federal funds rate to 20% by June of 1981. It caused a recession. Unemployment hit 10%. It was brutal. But by 1983, inflation was under 4%. And the decade that followed was one of the strongest periods of real wage growth in American history. I'm not saying we need a Volcker moment right now. April's numbers, 3.8% headline, 2.8% core, are not 1980. Not even close. But the lesson from that era that I carry with me is this. The people who came through those years in the best shape were not the ones who panicked, and they were not the ones who ignored what was happening. They were the ones who made small, deliberate adjustments, early. And here's the honest comparison I want to put on the table, because context matters. June 2022, the peak of our most recent inflation surge, headline CPI was running at 9.1%. Real wages were down 3.2% year over year. Energy was up 41.6%. Groceries, food at home, up 12.2%. That was a 5-alarm fire. April 2026 is not that. Headline CPI, 3.8%. Core, stripping out food and energy, 2.8%. Real wages, down 0.3%. This is a 1-alarm situation, maybe 1.5. But here is what worries me about 1-alarm situations. People don't evacuate. They should. Because there is one group of Americans for whom this particular inflation episode is not a 1-alarm situation. For them, the math works out differently. And if you are in this group, or if someone you love is, I want you to pay close attention to what comes next. Let me tell you about a very specific kind of financial trap. One that is perfectly legal, thoroughly documented, and almost never explained to the people it affects most. Every October, the Social Security Administration announces the following year's cost of living adjustment, the COLA. It's the automatic raise built into Social Security benefits, designed to protect retirees from exactly the kind of inflation we've been discussing. On October 24th of last year, they announced the 2026 COLA, 2.8%. For the average retired worker, that translated to about $56 more per month, bringing the average monthly benefit to roughly $2,064, which sounds like good news, until you look at what happened next. The COLA is calculated using something called CPIW, the Consumer Price Index for urban wage earners and clerical workers. Specifically, it looks at the third quarter of the previous year. When they ran those numbers last fall, inflation was running at around 2.5 to 2.8%. The math checked out. But CPIW in April 2026, right now, today, is running at 3.9% year over year. That gap, 1.1 percentage points, is not an abstraction. On a $2,000 monthly benefit, that is roughly $22 a month in lost purchasing power, $264 a year, not taken from anyone's account, not announced anywhere, just quietly eroded by the difference between when the adjustment was calculated and what inflation actually did. Now, I want to pause here and be precise about something, because I think imprecision on this topic does real damage to real people. This is not a broken system in the sense that someone made a mistake. The COLA formula does exactly what it was designed to do. It looks backward at a specific window of time and adjusts accordingly. The problem is that inflation doesn't move in straight lines. It spikes, it shifts, and when it spikes after the calculation window closes, retirees absorb the difference. But here's where it gets worse. The standard Medicare Part B premium for 2026 is $202.90 per month, up from $185 in 2025. That is a $17.90 increase, nearly a 10% jump in 1 year. And here is the part that most people don't fully register. That premium is not billed separately. It is deducted directly from the Social Security check. So let's run the actual math. You receive a 2.8% COLA, roughly $56 more per month. Your Medicare Part B premium increases by $17.90. That comes straight off the top. Your net gain from the COLA after Medicare, approximately $38 per month. Meanwhile, the inflation you're actually living. Gasoline up 28%, groceries nearly 3%, energy overall up nearly 18%, is running at 3.9% against your effective 1.9% net adjustment. $38 a month, against an inflation rate nearly double what your adjustment assumed. I want to say something directly to anyone watching this who is retired, or close to it, or has parents on a fixed income. This is not your fault. You did everything right. You worked. You paid in. You planned as best you could with the information you had. The system is not malicious, but it has a structural lag built into it, and right now that lag is working against you. The question, the only question that matters, is what you do with that information. And that is exactly what we're going to talk about next, because there are moves available to you right now. Not speculative moves, not risky moves. Moves that are sitting right in front of most American households completely unused, while inflation quietly does its work. Let's talk about those. All right, we've spent some time with the problem. Let's spend some time with the response. I want to be clear about what I'm about to share. These are not stock tips. These are not predictions. What I'm going to walk you through are 3 categories of moves, each one backed by publicly available data, each one appropriate for the current environment, and each one something you can evaluate and act on without needing a finance degree. Whether any of them makes sense for your specific situation, that is a conversation for you and a qualified professional who knows your numbers. What I can do is make sure you walk into that conversation informed. Let's start with where most American households are leaving money on the table right now. And I mean that literally. The VDIC national average interest rate on a standard savings account as of this month, 0.38%. The top FT-insured high-yield savings accounts available to most Americans right now. Accounts you can open from your phone in about 15 minutes are paying between 4 and 5% APY. 4 to 5% against 0.38. I spent 30 years watching institutions manage billions of dollars with extraordinary precision. And the single most common financial mistake I saw ordinary Americans make was leaving their emergency savings in an account paying 0.33% while inflation ran at 4%. It's not a small mistake. On a $20,000 emergency fund, the difference between the national average and a top high-yield account is roughly $900 a year, for doing absolutely nothing differently except where the money sits. Now, I want to name some specific institutions here, because I think it's useful to have real numbers in front of you rather than abstractions. As of this week, per Fortune and NerdWallet's tracking, Varo Bank is offering up to 5% APY on balances up to $5,000 with certain deposit conditions. SoFi is at up to 4.5% with direct deposit. Axos Bank around 4.25%. Viobank at just over 4% with broad availability. These numbers move. They will change. But the point is not the specific institution. The point is the category. FDIC insured, liquid, earning real interest while you decide what to do next. That is where your emergency cash belongs right now. The second move is one that most people have heard of but very few have actually used. Series I savings bonds, issued directly by the U.S. Treasury. The composite rate for bonds purchased between now and October 31st of this year, 4.26%. That includes a fixed rate component of 0.9%, which stays with the bond for its entire 30-year life, plus an inflation-adjusted component that resets every 6 months. Let me explain why that fixed rate matters. Most savings products, including the high-yield accounts we just discussed, will reprice when the Federal Reserve moves. If the Fed cuts rates later this year, those APYs come down, probably within weeks. The I-bond's fixed rate component does not move, ever. For 30 years, you are guaranteed to earn at least 0.9% above whatever inflation is running at. In an environment where we're debating whether inflation is fully under control, that is not nothing. There are constraints, and I want to be transparent about them because they matter. The annual purchase limit is $10,000 per person per calendar year. You must hold the bond for at least 12 months before you can redeem it. Redeem before 5 years and you forfeit the last 3 months of interest. This is not a liquid instrument. This is a parking spot for money you know you won't need for at least a year, and it is the only retail product currently on the market that mechanically guarantees a positive real return above inflation for 3 decades. For a retiree looking at that COLA gap we discussed, or for anyone within 5 years of retirement, I would encourage a very serious conversation with your financial advisor about whether this belongs in your picture. The third move is less glamorous than the first two, but in my experience, it is often where the real money is. Pull up your last 3 months of bank statements. I want you to look specifically at your fixed recurring expenses, the ones that hit every month without you actively deciding to spend. Insurance, phone, internet, streaming, gym, subscriptions you signed up for and forgot about. Here is what the April CPI data tells us about some of these categories. Motor vehicle insurance, which spent 2 years running at double-digit increases, is up just 0.2% year over year in April. That is the most competitive that market has been in 3 years. If you have not reshopped your auto insurance in the past 12 months, you are almost certainly overpaying. The communication index, phones, internet, cable actually declined in April. Carriers are competing for switchers right now. That is leverage. Use it. I'm not telling you to cancel everything and live like it's 1987. Though I will say, we got by. What I'm telling you is this. In an environment where the categories you cannot control, energy, groceries, shelter, are running hot, the categories you can control deserve a hard look. Every dollar you recover from an overpaid subscription or an uncontested insurance premium is a dollar that inflation cannot touch. 3 moves, 0 speculation, 0 market risk on the first 2, and the third one costs nothing but an hour and a willingness to make a phone call. Now, I want to address one more group directly before we close, because everything we've discussed today, the wage gap, the COLA trap, the practical moves, it all sits inside a larger question that I think a lot of workers are quietly asking themselves right now. Am I being paid what I'm actually worth? Or am I just being paid what my employer thinks they can get away with? I want to talk about a framing error that I think costs American workers billions of dollars every year in aggregate, and almost nobody names it directly. It happens in performance review season. Your manager sits across from you, or these days, joins a video call and says something like, "We're really happy with your work this year. We'd like to offer you a 3% merit increase." And most people say thank you. Here is what that 3% actually means in April 2026. Inflation is running at 3.8% year over year, which means a 3% raise is not a raise. It is a pay cut denominated in the language of a raise. You are being asked to accept a reduction in your real purchasing power, and the framing of the conversation is designed, whether intentionally or not, to make that feel like a reward. I am not saying your employer is acting in bad faith. Most aren't. What I am saying is that the merit raise conversation happens in nominal dollars, and your grocery store, your gas station, and your mortgage lender operate in real ones. That gap is your problem to close, not theirs. So here is a concrete anchor for that conversation. The Atlanta Federal Reserve publishes something called the Wage Growth Tracker, one of the most reliable, frequently updated measures of what American workers are actually being paid right now. The April 2026 reading, 3.6% median wage growth. For job changers, People who switched employers, 3.8%. For job stayers, people who stayed put, 3.66%. That is your floor. Not your ceiling, your floor. When you walk into a raise conversation, you are not asking for a favor. You are asking to keep pace with what the labor market is already paying people who do what you do. A 2 to 3% offer in this environment is not the market rate. It is below the market rate. The Atlanta Fed data is public, it is credible, and it is updated monthly. Print it out. Bring it with you. Let the data do the work. One more thing on this. If your employer genuinely cannot meet market rate right now, that happens, and it is a legitimate constraint, then the conversation shifts. What else can move? Remote work, flexibility, additional PTO, professional development budget, equity or bonus structure. Real compensation is broader than the base salary line. But you cannot negotiate what you cannot name. And you cannot name it if you don't know what the market looks like. Now you do. We've covered a lot of ground today. We started with a paradox, wages up, purchasing power down. We looked at the mechanics of why. An energy shock concentrated enough to flip the real wage calculation negative for the first time in 3 years. We looked at history, because I've lived through enough of these cycles to know that context is not optional, it's essential. We looked at who takes the hardest hit, and we looked at what you can actually do about it. Before I close, I want to leave you with something that I think is more useful than any individual data point we discussed today. Here is what I want you to take away from today. April 2026 is not 1980. It is not 2022. Real wages going negative for the first time in 3 years is a warning signal, not a crisis. The difference between a warning signal and a crisis is what you do with it. The people who came through the 1970s in the best shape weren't the ones who saw it coming first. They were the ones who made small, deliberate adjustments, and then stayed calm enough to let those adjustments work. That is the posture I'd encourage right now. I also want to leave you with 3 specific things to watch, because the defensive moves we discussed today make sense in the current environment, but environments change. And I think you deserve to know exactly what would change my thinking. First, if headline CPI falls below 3% year over year for 2 consecutive months, the urgency around I-bonds and high-yield accounts eases. The comparative case weakens. Second, if the Federal Reserve cuts rates at its June meeting, and right now futures markets are actually pricing a non-trivial chance of a rate hike, not a cut, high-yield savings rates will follow downward within weeks. If that happens, locking in a CD rate before the meeting becomes a priority conversation. And third, if real average hourly earnings turn positive year over year again in the May or June data, that tells us the energy shock is resolving, and we can all exhale a little. Until then, the moves we discussed are the right ones, not because I say so, because the data says so. Stay informed, stay calm, and take care of your household. 2 videos are on the screen right now. One on what Spirit Airlines shutting down means for the cost of your next flight, and one on what the new Fed chair means for your mortgage rate. Both connect directly to everything we discussed today. I'll see you in the next one.